soon. Start soon. Okay, so welcome to Think Up TV, and I'm joined by I would say old favourites, but abuses the term old and is too conscious of the word favourite in this world of equality. So two regulars on Think Up, and we are brought here today due to a post on Think Up by Charlotte Bowen, who was, and I was going to read it out, but I think that's doing her a disservice because you can never translate someone's two-dimensional thoughts into a three-dimensional context. So needless to say, the post was, in summary, around the perceived and real inequalities between, let's say, the richnesses of Africa and the existing poverty, and the overall disparity between the power lines of what some people would call greed and control versus very real human need and suffering. So that's my conclusion of what she was questioning. And she said, can anyone share some perspectives on this? Can anyone, give their view? And one of the things that she mentioned was, which is where I'd like to start this conversation on, was around colonialism and the impact of colonialism. And for those of you watching who aren't necessarily aware of this term in its meaning, of course, we all know, we've all heard the term, most have heard the term, but colonialism as a noun is the policy and practice of acquiring full or partial control over another country, occupying it with settlers and then exploiting it economically. That's the exact definition of colonialism. And the key point here is in the exploiting economically and then occupation. So,
so in that sense, can the Roman occupation of Britain be considered colonialism?
Well said, and that's where our springboard into this particular rabbit hole starts. There is an assumption, it would appear, that colonialism can only have, on balance, and from perspective, negative consequences. And so firstly, I'd like to talk about whether occupation of one place by a group is only ever bad, or is it inevitable? And let's talk about ownership, and we're going to get down to the grassroots of inequality from that, I would say. Prashant, you were saying about the Romans. Please let's discuss that. What's your view?
About the Romans occupying Britain? Well, I mean, they very clearly, they very clearly wanted Britain's resources. They saw it as a sort of distant kind of place where there was some horrid, vile, druidical cults that they sought to completely expunge and eliminate, and rule it for its metals, right? I mean, it was tin, and so I mean. So I don't think they had. It seems they weren't really terribly keen on bringing Roman law and Pax Romana to Britain either. They were only interested in its resources. So,
and when we could have maybe had a similar view when we looked at India and thought this is a tremendous boost for a supply chain. We can.
The interesting thing though about India is, when the English came to the subcontinent, let's call it the subcontinent because that includes Pakistan, Bangladesh, and all that. The level of technological development between the two cultures was about the same, and the subcontinent had a greater deal of per capita prosperity versus Britain at the time. So. So I mean, it's a different sort of thing. It's in fact, Britain. One could say that Britain went technologically ahead only because of the prosperity it was able to attain through its control of the subcontinent.
Great point. And Sarah, from your perspective, when you hear stories of our past, our forefathers and mothers, do you? And we will, to anyone watching, thinking, when are they going to talk about Africa and the poverty versus elitism? We will get there. However, we need to start from an ontological perspective of how things started. Sarah, when you hear these stories of our history, do you feel that they are riddled in a pattern of human desire for control, or are there more subtleties involved?
I think it's very much about humanity and humanity's desire for like a greediness in humans. I think personally, I try and kind of compartmentalize lots of things. So I think from what you were saying earlier about the UK, and I mean, we've all learned. We're at the moment. What's fantastic, I think, is that there is so much appetite to learn about history in a way that hasn't happened before. So for those of us that are born in the UK, in school we learn about history very much through the lens of the victors, and that's how the British see themselves. So often, my fiance is a history geek, and so we'll have little evenings in, and I'll ask him questions, and he knows lots about the Roman Empire and everything else. So whereas my knowledge is fairly narrow, but for me, yeah, I think it's in human nature of wanting to go out and seek the best resources to feed their civilization. So I think it is this. I mean, that's the whole thing. It's history repeating itself. That's why I think we have to be really careful, I guess, in terms of our perspectives and making judgments around Africa, India, when actually we're all coming from lenses of our own countries. And the information that we have access to.
Each of those situations is different. I think when the English came to the subcontinent, they didn't come as rulers. They came as traders, and they got caught up in all the fighting that was going on between the various kingdoms in the subcontinent, and eventually just found themselves as rulers. I mean, there is that part of.
Prashant, when in terms of that, so the time then, what year was that when that kind of, like you said, there was more of a, because often there's a stereotype around Africa, and the way Britain sort of colonized all the different African countries. In terms of India then, what year did, like, almost in a way that the British and the came together? What year are you thinking then in terms of that?
I think it was in the 1500s that the first Britons actually arrived in India at the court of the Mughal Emperor Akbar, traders too, and then they basically started setting up trading posts. Actually, it was the Portuguese who were much more interested in actual colonization and invasion. And in fact, the British got caught up in all of this. And basically, it was the British East India Company as well. It wasn't even. It wasn't even England. It was just private company setting up trading posts, and then they had to, for their own survival, start their own private armies, start sort of negotiating with the local kings and all that sort of thing. And they just got basically caught up in all of that.
Indeed, yeah. So it was 15, from my recollection, the Portuguese India was 1505 to 1961, actually. East India Company was something like 1612, 1615 or so forth. And then you had the company ruled in India in general from mid 18th century. Then you had the British Raj from late 19th century to about 70 years ago. And then Burma starting in 1824 amongst that. And I think it's one of those lesser studied parts of British education anyway. One of the things that I find fascinating is when we look at putting Black history into British education as something that must be done. It's like, well, okay, there's the Black history part into British education. There's also this massive Indian of British history that needs to be included here, because a large part of our trade routes were actually designed during these times.
Well, Britain's prosperity came from its Indian empire.
Totally. So surely that must be, we must look at
that. I think that's sort of part of my, so I've said this before, obviously my parents are born in Mauritius. So obviously we're Tamil, so we are Indian descent. So my relatives were brought over essentially by the British after slavery was abolished. So, the phrase indentured labour. So my ancestors were brought over to Mauritius, obviously, to work on the sugarcane plantations. So I agree with you, John. I see it as our joint history. I don't know if any of you caught, and this is obviously falling into this. It's like falling into the racism element, which John and I often end up in. The amazing Jane Elliott. I noticed this interview recently where she talked about how white people have faded black people, and it's that whole thing like, we're all one human race. And we've all gone to these sort of different countries. So I do find it interesting when in the UK, as you say, we have Black History Month, but it's like it's all of our history as a race. It's we're all we've all followed this path, and so that I find quite interesting. But I guess the reason is because Black people, in the same way in Mauritius as well, it's very noticeable. In the same way in the UK, Black people are treated in a way that's different, I think, to Asian people, in terms of the way they're dealt with by the police and the systemic structural racism that's within the UK, and obviously, very noticeable in the US as well. Yeah. But that's why it's difficult, because you can conflate all these different issues.
Indeed.
Where it becomes quite challenging.
Let's get to the systemic racism part in a minute, and because the first, on one step before then, what I was wondering both of your perspectives on was the whether or not, when we look at the inequality of a post-colonialized Africa, and the disparity between the haves and the have-nots, are we talking about a different context than someone who is of a gender in a particular role at work, who doesn't tend to conform to the privilege of another gender or another race? Are we talking about different here of disparity, or are these all different examples of how humans behave? Prashant and then Sarah, and whoever is bashing away in the background with hands, maybe put your mute button on.
So can you repeat the question again? Can you repeat the question?
Sure. I'm just going to, Sarah,
2 seconds. I'm just going to go and tell someone to stop.
Or just put yourself on mute. There's a big mute button on the screen. It's fine.
I don't think I've got a mute button on here.
That's all right.
I can't mute it.
Okay, that's fine. Prashant.
Sorry, that was an interlude.
That's all right. Prashant, the question is when we're talking about the disparity in post-colonialized have and have-nots in Africa, are we talking about a totally different context than a woman in a male-dominated industry trying to break through the proverbial glass ceiling, or a person of color in a white privileged context being seen as equal? Are these totally different contexts, or is the disparity basically the same thing?
I think they're basically completely different contexts, because, for example, when Africa was colonized, the locals were seen, Africans and Australian Aborigines were seen as subhuman, and they were treated accordingly, and that lies at the foundation of relations over there. So I think they were just used as exploited completely, and
Yeah.
So I think, for example, amongst the colonized subjects, there were hierarchies of who was higher, and even a lot of these subjects embraced these hierarchies as well. So, for example, Indians ended up thinking of themselves as being superior to Africans because their masters told them that they were. So that kind of thing.
Yeah. And Sarah, do you feel that the superiority is something that is inevitably thought from the previous generation's tuition? Are we not in a situation where it's not necessarily us coming up with a new thought of superiority? We're inheriting the learnings from our forefathers and mothers.
I think you're right. We're definitely inheriting that. As a I represent, I'm obviously female, and I'm a woman of colour, and also I've mentioned my ancestral history. So that superiority, I think, is really key. And often we talk about this, the white supremacy element, but actually I've certainly experienced superiority, or certainly hostility, from different races because of the boxes that I tick. I think again, it's about trying not to conflate lots of different issues.
Yes, indeed.
The gender equality element. I think one of the most frustrating things I've noticed in the UK is that when myself or my Black friends talk about racial inequality, another white person, female, will then talk about what it's like to be a female minority, which it just isn't the same thing. So it's a form of discrimination, but then you could be going into sexuality, disability, you could be going into all those different topic areas. Whereas I think that when it comes to racism, you have to, or racial inequality, let's spend a bit of time on that as opposed to sort of jumping into all the different elements. So I think it is different.
Okay, so goal 10 of the United Nations Sustainability Agenda is, and I quote, reduced inequality. Do we, that inevitable conflation that they've made there by adding, I assume, combining all types of inequality together into one overall ideological view of reduction, is there not an argument to look at diversity and the requirement for diversity and the reduction of inequality as something that is worthy of a conflation, worthy of a combination, because the mindset of diversity and the acceptance and inclusion and understanding is something that actually you would have to buy into wholesale to make any logical sense. In other words, those people who say, I'm not racist, I hate Indian people, I just hate Indians, or when I would say that I stopped wearing white shirts in restaurants because every time I went to the restroom, people would hand me their dishes, and then someone would say, but you're not even that black. Are we not really looking for ways of conflating or combining inequality intentionally so that we can actually address it from a macro perspective of mindset? Do we see that as well, Sarah?
Intersectionality. Yeah, definitely. I think if organisations are looking at if organisations genuinely are behind the 17 SDGs and they really want to make a difference and they want, this 10-year of action, so we sort out the planet and all that kind of stuff, then absolutely that intersectionality between all of those different minority markers is really important. But I think from my perspective, I still think we've got a big hurdle to climb over racism, whereas I think it can get lost in gender inequality and sexuality and trans and everything else, when actually we can't get over this issue where certainly in the UK, white people don't seem to be able to have the conversation about race. Right. So I almost don't believe we can really fix all those other things if we can't actually just get over this hurdle. And that's just my perspective.
And you're welcome to it. Prashant,
yeah.
Okay, Prashant, what's your version of that, or what's your view?
Well, for one thing, I mean, I am actually of the belief that, for example, I don't find it offensive, but I don't like the word people of color, because it puts a lot of people with different and unique histories under a single, in a single bracket. I think we should evolve into definitions of identities to reflect people's histories, and personal as well as collective. For me, it's my identity should be, I should be able to define my own identity based on the history of the subcontinent and its interactions, and probably and that could include a bit of Britain as well in there because of the interaction between Britain and the subcontinent and all that sort of thing. So I think if we actually start acknowledging the complexity of our personal histories as individuals and as communities or whatever, I think that would go a long way towards solving a lot of racial problems, because I find that even on the left, the insistence of person of color, or, for example, Black people, Africans, well, there are so many different cultures in Africa. There's so many different tribes that have their unique customs, and that some of which are actually hostile to each other as well. So why not just try and move towards a slightly richer definition of what our identity, acknowledge the richness of what our individual identities are.
Yeah, I think these are all valid, aren't they? All of the above. There's a taxonomy point, which is around the language we use and what becomes common parlance. And then to Sarah's point, there's a kind of an ordering of things to enable a prioritization to address the specific problems. I think what I started with was the suggestion of a macro perspective, which is racism and anyism is a hierarchical view mindset of superiority, which actually, if you address it at its core, then you by default then address all of the other parts of seeming hierarchy. One of the things that I found fascinating with my virtual reality course is that I've done through Goldsmiths, University of London, is that the profound impact of people who score pretty negatively on a standard racism test, which is sadly still to this day the most almost advanced version, is the speed of your reaction, positive or negative, once you see a different color face. And if you spend longer pressing positive over a dark face, then that's a higher likelihood of you being racist anyway. When you are inside a simulator and you actually adopt a different person, a different race in your avatar, and you are treated a certain way by other races inside that virtual reality simulation, the outcome is quite amazing. Without very much more stimulus, because to really understand, similar to people who've been cruel to children, put into minimization simulations inside VR, and they are this big, and then all of the adults around them are this big, and they witness that for 15-20 minutes, and their response then to their own children and other children is markedly different from understanding that. And I also do wonder, when it comes to climate change, see if you can follow this tangent, whether if we were to live in I played a modest hand in a simulation once on Second Life where a team flooded Second Life for a day, the whole of Second Life, the augmented reality, virtual reality game. And so people who had houses in Second Life suddenly were like, oh shit, right, we've got a roof. If we turn a roof upside down, that might be able to float, or we've got these vehicles and we can, and I do often wonder, if we actually, the people who live on coastal towns or in California, let's say, who with the 1.2 meter sea level rise, albeit in a virtual space, I think they would suddenly grasp the point of what climate change is about.
Oh yeah.
You've got a great idea there, haven't you, John? Because I think, what you were saying earlier around these, I guess, what prejudices, structures that get passed down through different, familial lineage. And it's quite hard to check that. I mean, that's why it's so challenging, isn't it? It's like if you've got somebody who's homophobic or somebody who is racist, and it's like, I think the challenge with the Africa thing is that people just think, when they think, especially in the UK, and I don't know what it's like in India, but in the UK, when people think about Africa, they think about Live Aid, they think about starving children. That there are African countries that are thriving that we don't hear about.
Yes.
And it's all down to that infrastructure, who's in government, all those kind of things. In the same way, in Europe, as a continent, there are countries that are thriving, and you've got other countries who aren't, depending on who's in the leadership position.
I mean, it maddens me when people talk about the ANC as being a terrorist group, and I thought, well, if you're going to their own country and treating them as second-class citizens, they're going to respond in the and that's how they're going to respond.
Yes. Yeah. And that's what's amazing about terrorism. Now we're in that part of the rabbit hole, may as well the C word can come out. That if you walk into someone's house and with a gun and you threaten their children, it's very likely that your reaction will be somewhat similar to a terrorist.
Yeah, exactly.
and in some countries in the world, some places in the world, that's known as your right to self-defense.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's as far as I can go down that rabbit hole. So taking to specific point around what is this? What causes this inequality we've noted here? But what could we do? And Sarah, I'm going to start with you with a specific question.
Okay.
Black Lives Matter is two things. One is an ideology, and the other is a political movement. On an ideology, the statement of those three words is ineluctable. It's unarguable in my view. Black lives do matter. So that's a thing in and of itself. And then you've got the political movement that's 7 years old, that started from Zimmerman's acquittal of the guys of Reynolds' death in 2013. Zimmerman gets acquitted. Brian Zimmerman gets acquitted. Black Lives Matter builds as a political movement in its force. Floyd gets his neck lent on, and then Black Lives Matter becomes the hashtag. And we now have Sky Sports, Premier Football, Mercedes-Benz have now decided their livery is going to be all black rather than silver to support Black Lives Matter. I was on an interview this earlier today with the British Book Awards, who want me to host next year, saying, should we have a category called Black Lives Matter? Now, I have an extraordinarily fundamental issue with supporting a political organization that is split into decentralized chapters, some of which are displaying extraordinarily anti-Semitic output and numerous aggressive standpoints and very, very questionable behavior, such as closing down prisons, defunding police forces, regardless of their kind of taglines of being non-violent protests. So away from the political movement and into the ideology, Sarah, do you feel that that the current, at the time of recording, we're now the 30th of June, do you feel as if that approach of bringing forth the calibration of Black lives does one of two things? One, increase equality, and two, then create some form of bandwagon that we can then backload other people's lives mattering, including those with mental health issues, including those who may have other challenges in their lives, or from different sexual standpoints, and the LGBTQ plus. You know, can we backfill other inequality issues? But the first point is really, is this the right approach?
So I think so I don't know a huge amount about the movement other than what I've seen on social and all those kind of things. The key point absolutely with Black Lives Matter is because fundamentally it's black people that are being murdered by the police, not white people. That's something that everybody needs to take seriously and be concerned about. Where I'm concerned, I guess, it is a political issue, but it's the element where it starts to ostracize the people that have the influence and the power. The bit that, I'm sure you felt this, but I during lockdown anyway, it's depressing enough. But with the current climate, it makes you feel kind of like you lack hope. And I suppose what concerns me is that it goes so far that you ostracize the people that we need to influence. And for me, the people that we need to influence are the people that are in powerful positions who haven't really fully appreciated the inequalities that are there because they're going about their lives kind of unconsciously unaware, or whatever phrase you want to use, that it's sort of pitching lots of people against each other. And, like fundamentally, like John, you're a mixed race person. If it goes so far, what do we do with you? Cut you in half? I want to live in a world. So I really believe in the 17 sustainability development goals. Why wouldn't you get behind one of those things? But half the problem, it's about money and it's about profit. And when you think about climate change, renewable energy, we know it's the right thing to do, but businesses are like, well, am I going to make any money from this? If it's cheaper, then they'll be all over it. So I think it's great that there is this movement and there's this energy amongst young people and amongst organizations to say they're going to do the right thing. And I think what's really good from a branding perspective is that organizations who have been half-heartedly sharing the black box and this, that and the other have been called out when you look at their boards when they're all white. So I think it's that energy is great, but what we really need is people that can affect real change. So the CEOs that genuinely believe in all of those different goals and governments. Whereas I think I don't know enough about the Black Lives Matter movement enough to kind of judge it, but I suppose I'm a bit worried that it's going to ostracize everybody.
Well, I would place a fairly solid bet on that happening, not least that if one were to buy into an ideology that's one were to inadvertently buy into a political movement under the guise of an ideology, one then needs to purchase the rest of the political movement's agenda at the same time. So if you are to say that Black Lives Matter and you are then hashtagging that and then changing your logo black or changing your car black or wearing black armband or anything else like that, you're also saying free Palestine. You're also saying that police forces should be defunded. You're saying the same thing. All I'm doing is taking a Black Lives Matter agenda here. So I'm not making this up. So if you were to take one, it's like saying, I'm really into soccer, but I don't like where the center spot is. It's like, no, you're into soccer and you're into where the center spot is and you're into where the penalty box is and you're into where the goalposts are and the fact that they're that wide apart. You're buying wholesale into it. And that's where I think we're going to all very rapidly, within a month or 2 months, become, unfortunately, aware that, yes, Black Lives Matter, and thank goodness that's actually being said. But, oh, damn, we've been inadvertently funding and fueling a political movement which is about a lot of stuff that we don't necessarily want on our brand to. And that, my friends, is within weeks of the 30th of June happening. By the end of August, the House of Cards will have fallen. And then the problem is that with that House of Cards falling, we may lose the priority of the fact that Black lives do matter.
But I mean, doesn't this just demonstrate the fact that basically society has generally been taken over by all kinds of extremists?
Yes.
Even causes have been hijacked by extremists. I mean, that's basically what it is. I mean, Black Lives Matters aren't, they aren't Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela type of movement. So.
No, and in fact, what I wish to be the case, and I've struggled with this for many years, is that if we could experiment with being colorblind, to actually understand the benefits that would come from it, because the benefits have to outweigh the costs for any change to really happen. And I believe actually that if you were to have a wholehearted capitalist, commercial-focused, consumerism-based agenda and want to treble your profits within 3 years, I actually think that you would do that more effectively if you didn't have any racial bias in your organization. So I think one day we may realize that.
Oh God, we all live in hope, don't we? That because that's the other thing. Like, we all know that diversity is good for business, and having a creative and diverse team, you'll see the impact on your performance. And not surprisingly, sorry to keep banging on about the SDGs, but the organisations that have actually embedded the SDGs into their organisations tend to be the ones that have a more of a diverse leadership team.
Yes.
So I think it's just the defensiveness. You know how I said earlier about how I compartmentalise? Like, I don't try and carry my ancestral chip on my shoulder. And so what I find really frustrating is that when people do and they're defensive about having the conversation, it goes back to my earlier point of us being, having a joint history. We all live on this planet. We all live in different countries. What I love about the Think Up movement is that we're all from different countries, all have had completely different life experiences, but I think most of us want to do the right thing, and we want to leave the planet in a good state for our children. We want to leave a legacy behind, but human beings are just so frustrating. It's like the behaviors, like I said, the extremists. There are lots of people that are leading the countries at the moment. Like, one thing that I find really frustrating, especially in the UK, we've got this sort of arrogance that we smugly have a go at America, and we're like, oh look, they've got Trump, and it's like, well, we've got Boris. So we might, the good thing about the UK is that yes, our police don't carry guns, but we've got our problems. But it's that whole kind of thing where people can sit in that superiority element where they sort of slate other countries but don't look at their own problems. So your simulation idea, I mean, how amazing would that be, that you create some kind of simulation game? I can play a different character every 10 minutes, but we sort of see what we can achieve if we actually work together. We put our egos aside.
Yes. I think the research that Goldsmiths have done is fascinating in terms of the impact on PTSD and actually mental health problems in even a wider perspective. The professor that I was learning from and still will continue to learn from, I hope, is actually did her specialization in her PhD on the mental health benefits of virtual reality. And I am unashamedly putting these forms of abuses against people of different colors and genders and everything, I would say, into the mental health problem bracket. Mm. And so, therefore, my conclusion is that virtual reality would be one way of really, truly addressing that to such an extent where, this is a bit of a radical idea, if you get into political dominance, you have to actually go through a program of maybe 30 hours of virtual reality simulations where you've experienced what it's like to be a black single mother from a council estate or an Indian shop owner in a country that is repeatedly graffitiing your doorstep. And I think you should, and then you become prime minister.
I think that's like, I think I should be prime minister. No, I think that on that basis, I had all this experience. Come on, give me the job.
External voice. You said that with your external voice.
I did. Oops. I honestly think that's I just think that's a fantastic idea, because that's half the problem, isn't it? Like, I've had so many conversations and meetings where I've just found it so draining, whereby you've got one person trying to educate another person using words and the other person just not getting it. Yeah. And so I think the it's like, again, it goes back to that Jane Elliott's experiment with the blue eyes, brown eyes thing. Mm-hmm. I think what a great opportunity to, but it's about whether or not people are getting behind it, and that's the issue. I think the status quo, if you benefit from the status quo, then it's easier just to ignore it and not to change things. I think what's interesting with the race element is that pitching black and white people against each other obviously is naive, because fundamentally, for me, it's money and class. So it's not always a colour thing. So in every African country, in every Asian country, in every European country, you'll have white people or black people who are rich, you've got everything, and you'll have the same colour, possibly slightly different shades, with nothing. So I think
in China, I know very few white Chinese billionaires. Mm. I know lots and lots of Chinese billionaires, but I can't tell you any British billionaires in China. So
I'd like to add a couple of points to that. To an extent, isn't neoliberal ideology responsible for perpetuating a lot of the extreme movements on the left that we see by basically dumbing down civic society through consumerism and it's a sort of like, for example, one could easily attribute the extent of black anger to a lot of the gangster rap that corporations have essentially created and all that sort of thing. And today we actually, basically, when you consider that black music is the source of all modern music, black music today is only associated with a few genres. And, so basically all these associations, so to an extent, it's this paradox where corporatization has essentially created corporatization promotes all these all these various angst so it can profit. So the modern left is ironically a creation of neoliberalism, woke culture, the same thing.
I agree, and I think due to the fact that inside our bracket of ideology we have to include not only consumerism but also ageism and sexism and racism and everything else, and capitalism. Actually, I do think you're right. Neoliberalism, in its ideological standpoint, is a fantastic marketing vehicle, and so it's extraordinarily powerful to, and unsurprising in a world where we're full of weapons of mass communication. To arm people with a nugget of an idea and then give them a social media channel. That's it. And so I say that slightly facetiously, but not totally, because it's kind of tragic that it's, on one hand, in my first TED talk I gave in 2010 in Manchester, I said that what if Mandela had tweeted? What if Che Guevara had mobile? What if Leonardo da Vinci had Photoshop? Would their output have been any different? And my conclusion to the TED talk was that no, actually, maybe the format would have been different, but what was actually mattering was what was in their hearts rather than what was in their hands. People who have little in their hearts and lots in their hands. And so we are flattered with a smorgasbord of ability to communicate giant global messages or micro 120 character global messages. But in the past, Che Guevara had to create a radio station called Radio Rebelde that actually had his group of disbanded, disparate pirates all tuning into literally the same frequency that resonated. Nowadays, you don't need anyone can stand up, and that's why you've got Boaty McBoatface as a votable political standpoint, and you've got we used to have the Monster Raving Loony Party as the biggest kind of weird out there type political party, and now there are dozens and dozens and dozens, and it doesn't really matter, provided you've got a Facebook page and a Google AdWords budget, you're laughing.
Yeah. Or crying. I don't know. It depends on what mood you are in during the day.
In closing, conscious of time, Prashant, in closing, what would if you were to leave a time capsule for the next generation and we're needing to phrase one sentence or paragraph as to one productive way of viewing the world we're in at the moment, from either an opportunistic or pessimistic or realistic perspective, what would you say in closing to maybe enable people to think differently in some way or think up about this topic?
In a single sentence?
Or a paragraph, I was being generous.
Okay. Well, I mean, embrace curiosity would be my curiosity about, and learn for yourself, embrace curiosity, and learn about other people's human experiences, whether at an individual or a collective level. I think it's, for example, suppose the school system was a lot more intellect intensive. Suppose you learned other people's histories and you learned other people's cultures more in depth. We'd probably not see each other in the sort of caricatural sort of, as caricatures. So.
Good. Thank you, Prashant. I love the two prongs of that, which is curiosity and education. Sarah, what would your take be on the handouts at the end?
So I would say in the time capsule, get off TikTok and Minecraft and all the other things that cool young people do. Definitely, say that again.
Tinder?
Get off Tinder. I don't know. Well, I don't like little kids don't go on Tinder. That's for like over 18s, Prashant. I think just get off your phones and read and go and meet people from different countries and cultures. And I think going back from what Prashant was saying about stereotypes, stereotypes are just, yes, they're useful in terms of us able to make, quick judgments. But yeah, spend as much time as you can with other cultures and, respect each other. And I also genuinely think one thing is like watch all of Jane Elliott's videos. Just, if you're going to go on your phone, just Google her and realize that we are one human race and we have one planet. And we've sort of, our generation and older than us have kind of sort of screwed it up. So it's really in their hands to kind of move us forward. But yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. And I will then close then on my version of these, which I concur with both of those. I mean, we're in violent agreement, as we often are, but that's okay. Hopefully people,
because we're so peace and we've got love in our hearts.
Yeah, peace, love, and mung beans. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I had mung beans in my diet for one entire day once. That was a dark, dark day. What I would say to any further generations listening or watching something like this would be that it is not what you do now, it is what you leave for the next that actually is going to matter the most. And we it will eventually come to mind to many people, I think, that the legacies that we leave is what really mattered with this life. And I think that macro change happens in multi-generational steps. And so I've got an 18 and a 20-year-old, and it's actually their children's generation that we will actually see needle shift changes. And so I'm personally not massively dismayed of what we can achieve on a visual empirical perspective in our lifetimes, apart from the bit which is what we have passed across to the generations next, and therefore arming them with what they can pass to the generations afterwards. And if we can do something that can eliminate any logical argument for racism or any of the other form of negative ideologies that destroy people's freedom and citizenship, then I think we will hand these batons over in the best possible way.
It's a think up channel for kids, John. Like there's another one you could be.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think that would be something that, well, it depends on if I can market in an effective way as TikTok, right?
Yeah.
I think the thing you have to acknowledge is that it's not a logical argument, and even amongst us, there are probably little bits of unconscious racism that keep rising to the surface every now and then. So I think we should see it for what it is. It's not a logical argument. There's nothing logical about it. I think it's because we treat it as something logical that it becomes hard to fight.
And actually, that's what I meant. And because there is no logical argument for it, we need to remove any form of argument that there is a logical argument for it. That's exactly what I meant. We need to worship the illogicality of it enough for it to become ridiculous. In a similar way of walking down the street totally naked would be absolutely absurd unless you are you've lost your mind in some way.
Or you're on a naturist beach. But or you're on a naturist beach where that's okay.
Yeah, exactly. That's not a public street, Sarah. You can you and your fiance can do whatever the hell you like. Yeah. Enough. Guys, thank you very much for joining, and I shall see you all soon, and thanks for everyone tuning in. Guys, you've been brilliant. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
See you soon.
Bye. See you soon.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.